All right. So welcome to the March meeting of OpenSLO, or the OpenSLO meeting. If you haven't already, go ahead and sign in. Hey, Marius, how are you? To start things off, we're going to go through the action items from last time. I think the one thing we had was looking into versioning the spec to avoid breaking changes. And I don't know if we actually got to that yet. Does anybody know if we got to that? I didn't see anything come across. Okay, I'm going to add that as an action item because I wanted to I'll assign myself this one because I think I need to make sure that at least get a ticket in for that. Next up is meeting timing suitable for other time zones. I'm not sure who put that on there. Was that anybody in Poland or Marius? Okay, I'm not opposed to it. I know that actually 10 p.m. or 10 a.m. Pacific is kind of late in Europe. Maybe that was Andrew, who's in Australia. But I am not opposed to doing different times. I'd like to be as accommodating as possible for everyone. I will also assign this to myself to talk to Andrew. Or just post in the OpenSLO Slack just to say, do we have anybody that wants to propose different times?
Yeah, I could start by asking like which region people are in to get an idea of how many regions need to be covered.
Yeah.
I know Europe and US, both coasts is probably doable in one call, but if you're trying to incorporate people from Asia Pacific, then that gets really complicated, and it might, excuse me, need like alternating early and late meetings potentially. I know some source communities do that to cater to all zones, but yeah, it gets tricky.
And actually, I misspoke. Andrew's in South Africa, not Australia. I don't know why I said that. Cool. Next, does anybody have anything else on that? Okay. So next, I think Marius, you had the SLI as a separate kind PR you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, but I see someone merge it like half an hour ago. So at this point, it like doesn't matter. It's merged. It got 3x, so I like it.
We did it.
Other people do as well, so guess it's in. So yeah, that's basically that for that agenda item.
Awesome. Sweet. Yeah, I think that's awesome. I'm really glad that we're able to do that. And I think that that's going to really help us in the long run. So I'm excited about that. I wanted to talk about SlowConf. If you guys haven't already heard about SlowConf, it's coming up. This is where OpenSLO got announced last year. We're aiming to try and have at least a stable version ready for that. I know both JB and Kuba have been working on that and are continuing to work on that. But the goal is, you know, one year later, have a 1.0 version or just a stable version to stake a or put a, you know, stake a flag in the ground for that. I don't know. Did you guys have more you wanted to talk about the 1.0, like how that's going? Kuba W or JB.
Yeah, but from my perspective, merging this SLI as a separate kind was a pretty big milestone for achieving stable version. From dangling PRs, I think we should merge and decide on the standardized duration format and documenting all of the quirks of the duration and usage is then in the rolling windows and calendars window. We have a pretty big discussion and it should be merged too. And also I created just before our meeting, so probably no one has opportunity to read the issue about the making source specification more general. Maybe I can talk briefly now about this and show what I mean.
Go for it.
Okay, and it should basically, yeah, you can see my screen. Yes,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
So basically, we have this approach that here is the source, the query type, query, and metadata. And this query type and query may not match every data source and how data source reference to this query like string and how many you need to pass to get data from it. Of course, I understand that in metadata, you can put whatever you want and we can basically overcome this, but maybe I could propose something like this. So for these data sources, I have data sources with example queries. It's pretty straightforward. It's mapped to the query. Even for example, in Graphite, it's not referenced as query, but as a metric part, but you figure out that you should probably put it here. I don't know what you should put in query type in such scenario. But for example, for data source like Lightstep, you need to specify two values, which are separate values to get metrics from it on which you can calculate SLO. And one is a stream ID, one is a type of data. For Pingdom, it's a similar thing. Check ID and status, and you specify it. For AppDynamics, you reference by application name and some metric path. For this integration, maybe in further, but Noble 9 already supports some of them, like Redshift, CloudWatch, BigQuery, you have plenty of opportunity what to put to it to make queries. For example, putting region may be useful, project ID, name of database, and other stuff. And it's not much this type. So my thinking is, and I would like to know what you think, that maybe we should go very flexible. Like, for example, our spec tells only like this, that you need to specify type, and it will be Prometheus, Datadog, Redshift, whatever. And for each type, it would be the nested spec. And in this nested spec, we can put arbitrarily chosen fields for every data source type to make it comfortable to use. So for example, for Lightstep, we can put stream ID and type of data, and knowing this type, you know, backends will know how to parse this spec, and if this provider which consume OpenSLO can support fetching data from this type of integration. And yeah, and this is basically what I put to this ticket, and I would like to receive some comments, thinking, and yeah, what do you think about this? And of course, this is very, you know, like napkin sketch of this this is, but the core is that I think that switching by type like Prometheus, Datadog, and having spec which is arbitrarily chosen for every of them, or maybe for by the provider or something like this. Maybe we can put some other fields here which will be required for every data source. But yeah, it's for discussion.
Just to clarify, that wouldn't extend the spec to include like the schema of each individual data source. Like if two different platforms had a different interpretation of what was required for Prometheus, they could interpret that, like essentially they could have different entries
even
there, and that's totally
we
fine.
can go that way, or we can present some predefined schemas, or at least how to query maybe, or even not, even just implement how you want. It's open question. I do not have a strong opinion how we should approach, but I think that, you know, specifying by OpenSLO every tiniest integration of it
It's
maybe maybe a little bit challenging. But yeah, but with this approach, everybody can implement whatever they want. Even, for example, for some internal use case to the internal system, they can put something and it will be good. So Oslo probably wouldn't validate it for the types. We don't know, or maybe for anything, because we can put whatever we want. So it's open question for us, for the community.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like the flexibility, like working backwards from the idea that there will be data sources that are not what we imagine them to be. Like there could be a data source that's like call a person and they tell you what the number is or whatever, right? But like as long as that the platform's doing the implementation of that, if that data source can still be described in this, and it sounds like it can, then that sounds really good to me.
So as part of me working with the sources within my source code, like ideally, and it's more of a general issue, I'd say, ideally, I would like to see something like a change similar to the one that just got merged with the SLIs. So basically, if I'm defining 20 SLOs from a single data source, I would like to be able to have a source kind, basically, and then just be able to source ref within the indicator, just like a source ref by the name of the already defined source, with whatever fields are necessary, including any authentication, URL, whatever, and have it work like that, sort of. I'm not entirely sure how it fits with this PR, because like the additional fields that are mentioned in the PR, are they specified at the source, as in like Prometheus has a URL, or are they specific to each metric, like indicator query?
Yeah, and this is good point, and I would like to, and you make this distinction. I would like to go a little bit further with it. One is to define data source. What I mean by defining data source, defining particular instance of Prometheus, of Datadog, way of authentication to it, etc., etc. And yes, it should be, from my perspective, it should be separate kind, and we should refer to it by the name. And the second part is defining queries for this particular data source, and this is basically what I'm a little bit focused in this my issue about this defining queries, and this should be backported for SLIs and for internal definition in SLO this way. And yes, so this is so for example, when you speak about this, we could put, for example, name, or data source ref here field, and reference to this kind data source which defines this authentication, URLs, etc., etc. I fully agree. I would rather do not want to put for every SLI, for every query, this authentication or some kind of URLs, etc., etc. Something. It may be a little bit tricky for some data sources how to defined, because for example, for this from big cloud providers, we may ask, for example, in this data source kind, probably account ID and URL, and it should be defined, but for example, or name. But for example, when you use CloudWatch, region where should be defined on the query level or on the data source level, it's something which can be discussed and open question. But yeah, to sum up, I fully agree that this authentication URL, etc., should be moved to the separate kind, and references here. And here is more about ways of querying and referring to some fields, because as you can see, for this data sources, one string is not enough. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing, what I'll add here is that, yeah, this was like the initial plan with the spec, and like how we kind of changed it from the Noble 9 implementation, is that the original plan was to have this as a separate kind, like the data source as a separate kind, because yeah, we didn't want to have to deal with all the like connection information. And so like the name in there was meant as just an arbitrary string to do that mapping to the data source kind, or just, but I don't think we ever actually got into putting it in the spec. So this is a good place to pick up on that. And yeah, as I'm looking at like your issue here, yeah, I think it would be great to like put that in, like all those different pieces in as like, key value pairs. We could just do and in the spec, and just have like project ID, region, whatever, in that spec as a key value pair.
The kind would probably have that. So the kind would have essentially a wide open collection of data key values that it could have, and similarly, the query would have its own set of wide open. Essentially, like both are full pure objects or pure maps.
Yeah.
And then it seems like the platform could allow for like overrides from the query information to override defaults from the kind or whatever, something like that. So you could have more flexibility, or you could reuse things as much as you wanted, or you could go the other route and be prescriptive and say like any overrides require a brand new data source, but that's up to the platform to decide on how they implement it.
Yeah, I could see, because we want to do something like that for like at least on the query side, because, or at least to be able to like do some sort of key value pair description of what we want for the query. Because like, let's say we're doing CloudWatch, do we want to hit the metrics API or logs or whatever? All number of different platforms have similar things. So
yeah, and it's easy to imagine that like you could have a project ID in the CloudWatch one that is distinct, where you'd want to have it as a completely separate data source, but you could also, it's also easy to imagine a scenario where people didn't have that discrepancy as far as like authentication. So you might just want to have one CloudWatch data source, and then you have that be provided at query time too. So having, as long as both sides are flexible, I think the platform can decide how they want to enforce policy there.
Yeah.
So there will be a large overlap with data sources on the field. So for example, like a region will be a pretty prevalent like type, and it would be worth standardizing those. At the same time, should it, like, considering how many potential data sources there are and how many corner cases that we might not figure out up front, do we want to standardize the fields for each data source type up front within this spec, or do we want to externalize it into some kind of supplementary material, like here's a hint on common data sources, and you might want to follow this because then you will be compatible with other implementations, but you don't necessarily have to, and we'd rather not have to specify it in the OpenSLO spec itself. So in principle, yeah, we would have the source definitions as a general structure, and then a reference, and here is a repo with common practices on various data types, source types, so you can like have an easier time implementing it.
I think we talked about this a little, maybe 2 meetings ago, but the idea of that living in somewhere like Oslo, or somewhere that Oslo can get access to it, so that an individual spec that's defined, like a specific OpenSLO specification that's set up, can be essentially like sent to Oslo to see which platforms it would be compatible with. Because if you have the platform specificity as like this additional library that Oslo can pull in, and they're mapped to, you know, the essentially the implementation specs of the higher level OpenSLO setup, then you can just make sure that like this one does support this data source or it doesn't, and that'll kind of give you that like red light, green light for where you can send that SLO.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's not doable for us to figure out
Totally.
what should be put to every data source, because they are, yeah, every month new shiny observability tool is going to the market. So yeah,
And internal
The-
tools are the same, right?
yeah.
Like there's going to be so many internal
Exactly.
tools that we don't want to support. Do
Yeah,
you think it's worth? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say the one thing too, that one of the initial like kind of goals of the way that we did it originally was to make it as like open as possible, because if we are running in like on an internal observability tool, so like let's say one day Datadog wants to use this, that data source and the connection string is going to look much different than if you were to be hitting that externally. Like if they have an internal ingestion of that, it will look much different, and we would have different things. Like we might not, their authentication mechanism would be different. Same as like if you're on Honeycomb or something like that, or Lightstep. So having it as open as possible, I think really helps with that.
Is it worth, and maybe this is like more into the specific PR that'll submit for this, but is it worth trying to standardize the types of fields that we would allow in that key value? Like it could just be like key and string, or would you expect there to be, I guess, Jakob, in your experience, is there scenarios where you'd have like a dictionary as a value there, where you need essentially that like recurring set of object types, or is it really just like a string and a string?
My thinking is rather that we, to be flexible, we should, for example, and you know, from the implementation point of view, basically here you have type, and for example, Prometheus, Datadog, etc., required string, and when you send this payload, parser, you know, when you're parsing, you read this type, and you try to validate the content of the spec, no matter if it's, you know, 1 level deep or 2 level deep, you know, the structure, you try to unmarshal this to this structure, and it passes your validation and unmarshal successfully or not. And it's up to the vendor for to what it's expected here. We can make, as we tell, for example, some, for this, the common one, for example, for Prometheus, for Datadog, maybe something more complicated like Lightstep, and make the suggestion, but we can't, yeah, so just put whatever you want and you consider as useful in the spec.
Yeah, I guess like the scenario I had in mind is that it's easy for me to imagine it where an implementation where you might want to describe validation logic in the data source kind, and then the query would include things. So if you're looking at something like a region, the kind might say, these are the regions we actually accept for this data source.
Yeah,
and then the query would include one of those. But in that scenario, the kind key value, the value in that is actually like an array of enums or something, right? It's not just a simple string. And
yeah,
for sure, like you could have it as a string.
But it's up to implementation, how it handle and interpret this value and allow, not allow.
Okay, so just
etc.
Got it. So essentially just making it like a fully wide open object that can have anything that's a valid object type, you can put into that kind spec.
Everything which is valid YAML, you can put inside it.
Love it.
Yeah.
Super extensible.
Yeah. I like this.
So as far as this, so this is actually not that big of a change if we want to get it done before 1.0, because like this is essentially just a tweak in the structure, and all the complicated guts like are externalized.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
Exactly.
I like this.
All in favor? No, I'm just kidding. We'll use the PR.
But yeah, no, I like this a lot. So thank you, Kuba, for doing that.
Okay, so as a next step, probably me with the help of the JB, or maybe some you want, but maybe we start with the pull request, and we will ask you for the review and the whole discussion will be here. If someone has some ideas and so on, which we don't speak, please put it into this issue to comments, and yeah, we will take it. I think next week we will have some time to work on it and to propose some pull request.
Okay.
I have just one. I don't know what are the common patterns when dealing with YAML, but like this proposal has the spec, and beneath it there is arbitrary names of fields, whatever.
Yeah.
The alternative for that might be not having a separate hierarchy, English, but instead having a specified short prefix where if a field starts with like a 3-letter prefix, it's ignored from a spec perspective, because the assumption is that you can define any arbitrary field name with that short prefix. Make sense? Is it used that way? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting idea, but it may be harder to parse it from the implementation level when you put it. Maybe I'm a little bit Go-centric, but I know from the experience how parse YAML with arbitrary or JSON with arbitrary fields in Go. You have to for every field you have to have it in the object. So this one source object, this in the struct. Yeah, I'm Go-centric, but in the struct you have to have everything like that. And you know, every field with the prefix for every data source, and you will end up with very long struct. And for it, you can have here, you know, general empty interface, and based on it, put the another struct to it and parse to it. So it's easier to maintain on the code level. And this approach is in Kubernetes, you have also that sometimes in the spec, you have other spec, and in the spec is something provided. And here is the hint, what you expect in the spec to be able to validate it easily. So this was my assumption and thinking why I proposed this in this way, and not with the predefined prefixes. And also with the prefixes, it may be that problem that when you implement validation for it, you need to validate that only one prefix is allowed in this case, because, for example, you know, defining here prefix for Prometheus and for Datadog in one section, in one SLI, you know, it's duplicated data, so you need to ensure that only this one prefix is defined. And here we are protected because you define Prometheus, and field for Prometheus needs to be put here. So yeah, this is my thinking.
I'm sort of sold on the argument that this is like a Kubernetes pattern, and yeah, it is a Kubernetes pattern, so it would be familiar to people, and I guess
Yeah.
that's sufficient reason to do it this way.
Yeah, and
Okay,
this is
so
a
next
little bit
steps.
roots from how in Go it's the easiest way to parse this.
Okay, so next steps are just like a PR, and then we can actually think through it and maybe figure out whether there's an easier way or
Yeah,
like
yeah.
tweaks, etc. Okay, I'm on board with that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Appreciate all the work on that. I think the only thing I had left, I just wanted to just mention, I think that we closed up the speaking CFP for SlowConf, but I think if anybody on the call wanted to sneak one in, we might be able to do that. If anybody hasn't already. but yeah, just let me know. And SlowConf is coming, and it's going to be awesome. I know we have tons more people participating and attending than we did last year, so it's going to be fun. Did anybody have anything else they want to talk about?
Actually, the duration shorthand PR, like
Mhm.
when discussing that change over the past few months, the idea for that change, there were references to how Golang internally implements duration parsing shorthand. And like from the quick Slack question I like asked 3 hours ago, it seems that most of what we need within OpenSLO as far as the shorthand goes isn't actually part of what the built-in Golang duration parsing does, which means we shouldn't be bound by it. And if we want a usable shorthand, we should just figure one out, specify it, and just like use whatever fits the best, right? Like
Yeah.
not try to
Yeah.
tie ourselves in with whatever Golang
Yeah,
I
supports
think
out of the box.
I agree on that.
I
Great.
especially think like I think you left a comment on that PR kind of describing like month, quarter, year, and I think that in particular is just not something that Golang has kind of as a default set of assumptions going on. So I agree, completely agree. Yeah, like this, we just need to be. I think it's reasonable to use that as kind of the starting as like a reference, so people are familiar with that style, but then we can extend it to fit the needs.
Yeah, again, the style is popular within Kubernetes as far as I remember. So yeah, should be.
Sweet.
Cool.
Yeah,
Well,
but
if-
one open question is how much specific we should be in our spec about this assumption which I put, for example, for calendar window, how year, quarter, month are treated, and should we be such specific in spec that we encourage companies which implements it to use it like that, that they count these months as they are real. So January has that number of days, February, and so on. And when they have start window and leap years, leap hours, etc. And this is the part of the spec. And from my perspective, it should be, because it makes OpenSLO more movable,
More
English.
transferable. Yeah, like an individual
Transferable,
SLO.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
more transferable, because you will see similar math, similar Windows treating, and so on different platforms, at least with this. And you don't think about it. But on the other hand, it may be a little bit too much and slow adoption of OpenSLO when we encourage, or people will break it and do not follow this advices which I put in the comments. So I think we should decide, do we want to transfer it to the official spec docs and how these windows are defined and how will be treated, and what week means in the rolling window, that it's a 7 days, 7 time 24 hour, and what week mean in the calendar, that is the 7 days, and for example one day have 25 hours because you have the leap day in this week when this windows comes, and yeah, this period is different. So leap hour time, I don't know how it's called. So yeah, so this is my thinking, and this basically stops me from approving this, PR, or thinking about closing it, and yeah, and how we should approach this.
So from my point of view, as an implementation, like hints on implementation, like it's a separate, when it's a question of the rolling window one, then yes, we define like a week is 7 days, which is 7 times 24 hours, etc. Exactly. However, the durations on the calendar one should be defined as if it's, for example, a quarter should be defined as the exact same time 3 months ago. A year should be defined as the exact same date and hour and second, but a year ago. This way, whether it's a leap year, however long the quarter is, say Q1 isn't equal to Q2, isn't equal to Q3, this is just skipped because it's calendar aligned. So so we should like explicitly say that you defined it in terms of the calendar. Look at the current timestamp, subtract 3 months from that date, and you have your quarter. How many days it is doesn't matter. That's how you define it. That I'd say we should like make it like a short description that, hey, this is how you should implement it. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble if you do it another way and like arbitrarily decide that like a quarter is 90, I don't know, days always.
Yeah.
That would be pointless.
I
Yeah.
I feel like it's I think I would, as a consumer, I would like the prescriptiveness of saying this is exactly how you can trust it, but I think realistically it's going to be so specific to each platform and how they implement, because even like your description of like a week is 7 days and it's this many hours, I think that what Jakob W, like what you or Kuba W you just described, that some weeks won't have that many hours, they'll have one fewer hour, and so if you go across that, like you'll have the leap year window, or even like in the US we just did daylight savings time, so we had like we had one fewer hour over the last week than we did in the weeks previous. And so that in that scenario, the calendar alignment still kind of feels like what I would expect as a consumer. I want Monday at 10 a.m. to still be Monday. You know, if I'm looking at a week back, I don't want it to go back to Monday at, what is it, 9 a.m.? I don't know, whatever. All these, you know, ridiculous time stuff. So it feels like one of those things that the platform is going to have to like choose how they deal with that stuff anyways. And I'd almost rather have the SLO that's imported into the platform match the platform's familiarity with time than have it be tied to a different set of like time management that is unique to the spec, if that makes sense. Like, and I'd hope that they're all the same, but I think in reality, the platforms might deal with time differently. And so I just want that the SLO that's imported to match that, like the environment's idea of time.
Yeah, this is interesting point of view, because from my perspective, I'm thinking about calendar window as something specifically designed for humans, and even for not technical one, and even I know I shouldn't, but you can easily transfer SLO to SLA, which is the most interesting to some execs, and I will suppose that it should work as human calendar work, you know, as I described here, and this daylight saving and so on should vanish, and quarter should be quarter. So when you start first of February, you end 1st of March, you know, you have 1st of the April, and you know that basically with the end and so on, and this rolling windows are more this for technical people when they want to measure something, etc., because you know they can reclaim this budget and it goes and so on. So this is my thinking, but your point of view is interesting, that some platforms may think about time and about quarters in some specific way, and should we bother about it, or should we tell that the SLO calendar aligned is how human calendar works, and yeah, that's all.
Yeah,
I'm sort of sold on the concept that this would be implementation specific. Like now that I'm thinking about, I don't know, business practices in a large corporation, they're using some kind of, I don't know, ERP system or something, and they have a bunch of assumption-based assumptions baked into it, I would assume. So the spec shouldn't like tell them, you can't do that. Your way is wrong. The spec should probably, we may suggest how we think it should be done, or maybe even not that, and like explicitly state, hey, how a week can be whatever you want in the implementation. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think is if we've got like there are some fields that are required, which is like the duration, and then to me, good platforms would enforce a time zone and a starting time for anything calendar aligned. But other than
and
that,
it will align as human calendar.
Yeah.
You have all the
Yeah.
information to make it robust in this
Yeah.
in this point of view.
Do you think it's worth restricting the types of duration that can be used in rolling? Like, should rolling quarter be a valid thing, or
No,
should we just?
because you don't know what quarter mean. From
Well,
my
I mean,
perspective,
yeah,
in rolling window, valid are minute, day, week, defined as 7 day, 7 day, 24 hours, hour, and that's
Yeah.
all. When someone wants month, they can choose arbitrary number of days, 30, 31, 29, and treat this as a month in their internal model of the month.
I mean, I think like when you look at like a moving month or whatever, rolling month, I think something like Grafana does do that math for you, where it'll look like it's the first to the first, and that if that's 31 days or 29 days, like it just takes care of it for you. And so you can have this view that does shift month to month, and then if it just, I don't know how it does it, if it just like whoop, now today's like slightly longer or something, but
okay, so even when I define, for example, February the 5th, and
Yeah.
it will count to the what? To the March the 5th as a month and late, but yeah, because
Yeah,
for
I mean,
example,
it's
when
weird.
it
It feels,
rolls, it will be 5th,
yeah,
and I don't know, I don't know
totally.
the behavior of Grafana, so.
I think if you're looking at something in, that goes across February, it will, and you look and you do the drop down for a month, I think it does go back to the date that it starts. It's not like a hard 30 days, but I think you can similarly say, I want to look at 30 days ago, and then it'll go back and count the days. But it feels like a platform specific implementation. Like that's unique to their way of describing how they wanted to deal with that.
My comment on that PR assumed that like non-rolling is calendar aligned and rolling is like just a duration. A week is 7 times 24 hours and like nothing else. But now that Mike, that you said that like the rolling can be calendar aligned as well, because why wouldn't, it's not impossible to implement it as calendar aligned, in which case, if I'm assuming that some weeks have 1 hour more than other weeks, then why would I not allow months and quarters and have the rolling window implemented as basically calendar based and not duration based? In which case we probably shouldn't ban it outright, because like someone might want to use it and there is a way to implement it, even if it's a bit wacky.
Yeah, I feel like as a consumer, I want OpenSLO to be so prescriptive, but then as a platform owner, I'm like, I get that you're going to have weird stuff across platforms. Like this is kind of why payments don't even make sense when they go across platforms, because each bank does things a little different for some reason.
Yeah, so I'll have to retract my suggestions from the PR to actually limit the.
Well, I think that like the duration shorthand stuff still works. It might be. Well, no, I think it actually still works fine, right? Your suggestion, because there isn't logic in there yet that is saying, if rolling, then you can only use these durations. If calendar, you can only use these.
Yeah, but my suggestions were to actually explicitly state that if it's rolling, then it can only be day, week, and nothing else, because everything else is arbitrary. But like a day can be 23 or 25 hours, basically in practice. So at which point, why not a quarter in rolling and why not a month in rolling? It's implementation. It's an implementation detail, whether it's a duration with fixed times or whether it's calendar aligned, at which point 1 day can be 23 hours.
I feel like I'm only thinking about this because we just had this time switch over in the US, and I'm looking at the Datadog graphs and they go to the hour. If I look back a week, it's like the hour today to the hour a week ago. And it's not, they don't just have like an hour that's disappeared because we jumped ahead. And I think that makes sense from a user perspective. I'm thinking like 10 a.m. now, and I'm looking back a week, I want it to be 10 a.m. then, but it's definitely harder for the platform to implement, to like do that math.
Yeah, but it's both choices are valid, and if both choices are valid as a way to implement, then we shouldn't like tell that one choice is bad and don't do that.
Can you hear me? Okay, it works because my headset, discharge. But my thinking is that why I allow day, because mostly day is 24-hour, and I can tell that this is the day of 24-hour and week 7 days with 24-hour. Only with daylight saving time countries, 2 times in the year, they have more than 24 hours. It is pretty typical. Why I do not put a month to this rolling window? Because we have 12 months, and every month, next month has a different duration, and I should introduce some artificial month of 30 days, 31 days, 28 days.
I think it's harder for the platform to implement, but I think if we're working backwards from like SLOs are defined around teams a lot of times, right? It's like team ownership stuff. And I think it's reasonable for teams to have an actual calendar aligned, like month-long sprint sort of stuff for their things. And so if you're looking at that,
But I guess
that is a calendar aligned performance.
I do not understand how rolling can be calendar aligned in the same time.
Like, yeah, I'm trying to think of a scenario where like
because I thought it's impossible, because otherwise Noble 9 will implement this too, and we don't implement this. But this is,
yeah. Like one of the things
from the experience and from my perspective, it's impossible to have rolling calendar aligned, because I'm moving and how it shrinks, it grows.
Totally. Yeah, no, I totally, I mean, I hear you that like it means you have to do a lot more logic every time you're querying data, which is super annoying on the platform side. But I think that it's reasonable for like Salesforce does this. Salesforce deploys once a month.
It's possible.
Sorry?
It's possible to do robustly, because I can't imagine, because I'm starting the month window in the arbitrary day, and later I have a next day, and I change the size of this window based on week mode.
Yeah, no, yeah, like knowing when you do the window expansion or contraction is like, it's very confusing to think about like what the right time to do that is. And I don't have the answer for that. I just think when I'm thinking about, there are teams that deploy once a month, and that's specifically on like the day of the month, and Salesforce does this. And if you want to ensure that your rolling window accounts for one deployment every time, because that uses some of your error budget, you need to make sure that that day of the month is kind of included. And you can do it, you can get around it by saying like, okay, we're gonna have like 33-day or 32-day windows, and that's going to guarantee that one of those days will always be included. But I can see a reason for a team wanting to say, I just want it to be the month. But that maybe that's calendar aligned, but then you get the weird stuff of like at the beginning of every month, your budget's all wacky because you have so little traffic until you start to build more stuff up.
But
I don't think we necessarily need to support it.
Basically, I want to deploy on first day in the calendar month window to have that day the whole time in this rolling window. So from my perspective, it's a bad practice, and this is you should use calendar aligned
That's fair.
It's like hacking SLO. You want to measure, but you want to hack it. So from
like you want, that's fair. That
I agree that some enterprises may have this kind of reasoning and want this, but from my perspective, it seems not right.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah, I think, yeah, maybe this is a good like Slack and PR continued discussion to try to figure out like how prescriptive we want to be,
To be
right?
honest, from my perspective, it's something like you, for example, measure a temperature of somebody, and before you put an ice on his forehead to measure less, just before measurement, you know.
Yeah.
You,
Yeah, it's inconsistent. So your values are going to be like less comparable across ranges and stuff.
yeah. But
Yeah, it's
I think it's also a case of figuring out, because there's two different aspects. There's the one is what does the spec allow, and then two is what is the prescriptive way OpenSLO says to do things. They can be a little divergent in terms of the spec can be more flexible. Granted, that does leave the door open for users to potentially shoot themselves in the foot accidentally, but at the same time, it does provide greater flexibility. So it might be a case of allowing this in the spec, but saying in the prescriptiveness that this is the way we see this being used, even though these other things might be possible.
I think it's also reasonable to like have validation checks for each platform to say like, hey, we noticed you have a rolling 1 month like window. We actually don't support that as a platform. So if you're going to import this to us, you need to change it to a rolling 30-day window.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's reasonable.
This way.
Cool. All right. Well, did anybody have anything else they want to add?
I think I will just say like I would approve any of the PRs related to duration shorthand. I think even if we're restrictive, I think that would be fine to sort of start out and get a feel for what people are doing. And if we're not restrictive, I think that would be fine too.
Yeah.
I think more than anything, it's like we just know that this is a weirdness in the spec, and so iteration is better than leaving it funky.
I agree. Cool. Well, if we don't have anything else, we got 4 minutes we can give back. Yeah.
Extra coffee.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone. And I will be talking to you soon.
Thanks.
Bye.